heard from an earlier session that the air is quite loud. So thank you for joining us. We're going to be talking about primary rights and the inequalities of ebook access. And I hope that you enjoy all of our lovely images that we've included. So this slide and the next one are just some statements that we received from different librarians around the world that we talked to and a university press. So I'll give you a moment to read some of them. And as you're doing that, I will tell you how both of us kind of got into this topic. Rowan was coming at it from the point of view of an e-textbook project that she had been looking at and getting electronic access to textbooks for their students. And myself, I actually came at this more from being an e-preferred library, starting to see these titles pop up more and more that we're going to talk about in our evidence-based decision-making. So this came up quite a bit, in particular with one publisher, and I really was interested in that. And I had, of course, some interest in e-textbooks, but not a huge interest at the time. And just as a preface, we are both Go-B libraries. So that will weigh heavily into some of the images as we go forward. I know, well, my introduction is coming in a moment. That's why I didn't want to give it too much up front there. Just to provide a little bit of context too, is that in conjunction with the topic for the conference, we really did feel that we've talked of many things in relation to ebooks, but not necessarily around the rights of ebooks and how that comes to be kind of more in the foreground of the conversation that's been taking place. So a little bit of introduction for myself, and then a little bit of introduction for Rowan as well. I am at the University of British Columbia. I am on the Okanagan campus. My name is Ariel, and I am the collections librarian for that campus. So our campus is significantly larger than Rowan's, as you can see from this slide. And within the University of British Columbia, we do have two campuses that do have individual budgets. We have a pretty large collections budget, 18.9 million. That was 2 fiscal years ago. And we do a variety of collections approaches, everything from front lists down to title by title selection. And it encompasses about 40% of our overall budget for the library. And I'll pass it off to Rowan just for a quick second to introduce herself as well.
Not sure why it's doing that. All right, so my name is Rowan Janik, and I am the Web Services Librarian at Okanagan College. And essentially, you can see our budget is significantly smaller. So we purchase a lot of things title by title, a lot fewer packages. We only have one EBA program that we may or may not continue with. Similar issues, completely different institutions. Okay, so essentially, we saw this issue arising and began to kind of wonder, why were we in Go-B and seeing all of these unavailable in your country messages when we wanted to buy an ebook? And so we were wondering whether it was something that was specific to North America, whether it's just affecting Canada, does it affect the US, or on a broader scale? So I put a call out to for information to some listservs as well as some colleagues that I know outside of Canada. And we received responses from 8 different countries. And what we found was that the availability of ebook titles completely varied by country. And so the chart shows the results of our consultations. And so each librarian ran a sample of a list of titles that we gave them through their main library acquisitions platform, which we are now calling LAPS. And then they sent us their access information. So note that here, this first line is in Canada, and we have access to none of these titles in ebook format. And then it has varied format completely depending on the country. So England seems to have the most access. And then also note in some cases that the cost of acquiring some of these titles, the yellow ones, were probably, no one would probably buy them based on the cost anyways. And what was also interesting was that we weren't expecting was the variance in availability across the library acquisitions platform. So one platform you could get it and one platform you could not get it, and that varied by country. So then the case of the print book. So one of the librarians that we interviewed was from South Africa, and she said, this is really interesting. And then she sent me this picture of a print book. and that's in her collection. And so the book is titled African Theater. And note that there's a territorial restriction assigned to the print book that says paperback for sale in Africa only. And so I saw this example and I went into Gobi to check for our availability. And what I found was that, hold on, I gotta flip my pages over here. There we go. So I go into Gobi and it appears that the book does exist, but with no options to purchase. So I can find it but not buy it through our library acquisitions platform. So logically, the next step to do would be to check Amazon. And actually Amazon is our second preferred, our second buyer. So we buy, second to probably Gobi would be Amazon for purchasing. And what was interesting was that in Amazon, not only am I able to actually find the book, but I can purchase it from a UK supplier who ships to Canada, and I'm paying in Canadian dollars, so I'm saving about 25%. And so in the world of e-commerce, do these transnational country restrictions even have a place anymore? So absolutely, in terms of ebooks, where the online world actually has no physical boundaries, why are we assigning these territorial rights? So unequal access to content is really unrealistic in the online world. We have borderless, essentially a borderless world when you're working in an electronic commerce market. And publisher agreements are really stuck in the print world. They're really stuck to format. And with format really being treated as a separate entity. And so if you rework a book into something like a movie, which has to do with rights, it changes the story. But if you change the format of an item from physical to electronic, it doesn't actually change the material itself. And so to quote back to one of our librarians that contributed, she said, "We thought this was a third world problem." It's kind of a shame that in the world of libraries, we're associating this with a third world or a first world problem. And also, why are we not doing something about it?
So I'm going to talk a little bit more about some definitions in case you're a little confused at this point. So primary rights, this is also something that going into this, both of us did not know a ton about in terms of how people were defining this. Primary rights, as you can see up here, there's two definitions that I pulled. One is a little bit more general. One is definitely more specific around English language. You can also see as an extension of this usually has to do with first printing, if there is any anthology pieces, book club rights, which was surprising to me, and then any reprint information. And so the piece to remember about primary rights is this is really what is being given over to the publisher. So when we're thinking about these, this is what they will have the most control over. An extension of this is the territory or world rights. So this is an example of pulled from a book. And in this, the author is going through and identifying for potential researchers or authors themselves what they should be able to see in a contract when they go in to negotiate. And he actually goes through and he gives examples. So this is one example where he specifically says that different UK publishers will often give a list of territories or countries that authors can choose from where they would like their book published. At the bottom, you can obviously see world rights is there with all languages. So obviously that's always the goal, and we'll see from how we talk to some publishers, that is definitely the response that we got. From the point of view of some of the conversations that we've had since seeing this, and you can see this is from 2011, it seems to be that this definition of what is provided in contracts has changed, and it either is non-existent or it is very much limited to world rights. So again, the second piece to this is the subsidiary rights. So as I just mentioned, the primary rights are going to be those that are really surrendered over to the publisher. That's what they have control over. The subsidiary rights are those that the author typically retains. So around adaptations, translations, excerpts, any audiobooks that might come out, as well as Rowan mentioned, films, which is particularly important. So you can see that, again, there's some differentiation between descriptions up here, but it's definitely those pieces that do tend to reside with the authors. So this example here is an excerpt from a very long response that Rowan received from somebody at Ohio State University Press. And it is an example where he is discussing subsidiary rights. And he goes on to explain that basically he feels they're the best for the author and that librarians hate it. This is just kind of the bottom line of it. And that he has, as a publisher, the most success when the authors are dealing with a literary agent as a go-between, because they know going into it what to ask for. Versus just the authors, they tend not to always have that black and white knowledge. So one example of this is that he gave is comic strip authors, where they may want to retain their rights to then publish it as a book later on. So when you do see those popping up in newspapers, these are really what's being negotiated to publish them. So in general, the process that we kind of came up with in our minds and what we've written out is an author writes a book or a manuscript, submitting it either via a literary agent or directly to a publisher, who may at which point provide a list of territories, as we saw in some examples, or it may be very much down to where they have distribution offices, where they have distribution rights, as we saw with the print title that's only available in South Africa. All of these come into play. So from here, the author directly or the literary agent that they're working with may then go back and ask for certain things to be changed before finally having that title sold. Now, the one big thing to remember is that that step there may not happen at all. So I did talk to one faculty member at my institution who said, well, I got my contract. It literally never said what format it was going to be released in. It never said where it was going to be distributed. And I'm going to give you a little bit more context to this example later on and what happened, but just to say that this doesn't always come in one shape. So Rowan is going to talk about aggregators.
LAPs, yes, we're calling them LAPs, Library Acquisitions Platforms. We had to look at what the actual term is. So we thought that it would be helpful for you to have some kind of an understanding as to how information is populated in these acquisition platforms, because we really didn't know ourselves. So essentially, the title feeds are ingested from publishers and aggregators, and as sort of the first step, and it's completely automated. And then the second step would be that the title feeds are already include those territory and the access rights once they get into the acquisitions platform. And so essentially, those who run these e-content suppliers or the e-suppliers, they have no control over the rights that come with those books that are appearing in those acquisitions platforms. They just sort of appear. It's completely automated. And so data gets out really quickly, which is great for us as librarians. We can purchase them. But then if rights change, they don't get updated as frequently. And there's little interaction from a person or an individual or a vendor to correct those rights. So if you're a vendor, a rep for a Canadian library, you don't have access to go in and remove all of those titles that aren't available in Canada. So in one source that we read when we were trying to define primary and subsidiary rights, the process was compared with trying to catch a greasy pig. And so there's so many confounding and contributing variables that it's very difficult to determine what the reasoning is as to why an individual title is not available on a worldwide scale. So here's one example of uncertain availability. So will this content be available for the long term? Essentially, when a book is published in print, but then also published electronically, there's no way of actually knowing which titles will be available forever. Right? Maybe for life of format, but maybe not. It completely depends. And so here's an example of a title written by a UBC, University of British Columbia professor, and note that it's available through one library acquisitions platform, but not through another one. And so even if a publisher and an author have negotiated subsidiary rights to publish it as an ebook, there's actually no guarantee that it'll be available widely through every single vendor. And so we're wondering, why an author probably doesn't have enough knowledge to be able to negotiate why it would be available through one acquisitions platform and not through another one. So we're curious as to where these discussions are happening and who's making these decisions. And so here's another example, and this was from an experience from a librarian in Scotland who was told that often for us, the status field seems states available, but then under library availability, it states unavailable in your country. And so when they contacted their vendor about this, they said, oh yes, the status available is for our US customers. You should just ignore that, which just makes us angry. So this record was populated by that automated feed, right? And so that's why it's showing up in the library acquisitions platform. And so then textbooks, which is kind of like the big elephant in the room. So here's our example of some textbook titles and what the availability was like across countries. So when the titles are available, often the cost is completely prohibitive. We would never spend that much money on a single-use textbook title. And so vendors need to maybe intervene to exclude some of these titles so that we don't see them. It kind of, taunts us. It also makes us sort of wonder why it can be available as an ebook, but at that price point. And so this is something that's definitely been affecting us. And also, we had a DDA title that was triggered through our DDA program. It was a single user copy triggered through our preferred library acquisitions platform. But then only to find out after we got a turnaway that we could actually buy the title from a different provider as a DRM free title for less cost. So had that title not been included in our DDA program, we probably would have bought it through the other platform. So, having titles in there with completely different access rights and different price points is not serving us well if we're going to continue with these DDA type models. And then, so another issue with availability, this would be another example of a title from two different providers. So essentially, the top title was DRM free, and it was a lower cost than the other titles that were available from different library acquisitions platforms. Another case of unavailable access would be the package access versus title by title. And so this was something that Ariel and I did not realize was a thing, because Ariel purchases often complete packages of ebooks, whereas we purchase a lot more title by title. And what we found was that we were not able to purchase the same titles that Ariel had access to because they were purchasing as a package. And so we have this unequal access to resources within our same city. But because she has the funding to purchase as a package and we don't get access. So how fair is that? Just because cost is a barrier for libraries just as much as it is for our patrons. And then there's the changing simultaneous user licenses. So unavailability of titles can be related to the issue of changing access rights. So I've seen titles start out as unlimited user, and I've seen them then be reduced in the number of users. I have seen the opposite happen, where it starts off with limited users, and then it goes to unlimited after a period of time. So what I started doing is I just put them in my shopping cart, and I just wait and hope that it might change. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't, but I've seen that the access rates change over time. And then price fluctuations. There's also the issue of prices and how that plays into availability. So in some cases, prices of titles actually went up over time, where they started at a certain price point and then they increased. And then in another case, the prices went down. We couldn't figure out what the rhyme or reason was. I'm not sure if it's based on how popular a title is, or again, if it has to do with author rights or royalties. But the prices are changing, which can be frustrating if you've just paid a lot of money for a title and then you go back a couple months later and it's a lot less expensive than it was. Last but not least, so in this example, the prices vary widely also by the platform, like I said before, and with one provider listing the title about $40 higher than another provider.
So I'm now going to give some examples of variable access rates that I've seen as well, and some things that really frustrated me. So the first one is obviously kind of what sparked this whole entire presentation. We started emailing about this statement, the unavailable in your country, the message that mocks you. So really, this kind of comes up in a variety of different ways. From some of the conversations that we had, this really centers around older content. So if publishers are purchasing imprints over time, they're not always able to go back and change those rights that got negotiated on the original titles. And so they do have to just use what was in those contracts. It also may be that the publishers that had those distribution rights did not then negotiate subsidiary rights. So that can sometimes come through with translations a lot of the time. And my institution is quite large. We do purchase translations, and so that sometimes can be a hindrance. The third thing that can sometimes happen is titles with third-party content. This happens a lot in Canada and is not always an issue in the US, but images often don't carry the copyright to extend to being available in Canada. So content automatically gets excluded because they have those images. It also happens a lot with texts about writing, so teaching writing to students. They'll often pull excerpts from other writing pieces, and those also don't carry the rights to circulate in Canada. The final piece is that the author could have proposed the exceptions around countries and territories, which I think is the least likely thing that is happening. I don't think that they're sitting there saying, no, Canada's not going to want my book. I'm not going to sell it there, or any other country around the world. So you can see down below, again, Rowan put in another graph for us around a few more titles that are available in various places, and you can see again that they do vary by different platforms that they're being made available to. So it really is frustrating to continue to see these. And I agree with Rowan. If they can just be taken out, that would be great. Okay, so this is an example of a title where they are both published by Penguin, except they are different languages. So one is English, one is Spanish. They're from different imprints of Penguin, neither of which are available in Canada. So, one thing to highlight here is the piece on the last slide where I talked about dates. So these are both older titles, and so it could be that when they went to go reprint them, that the dates just didn't coincide in terms of the contract and being able to sell in Canada. So going to a few of the conversations that we had, Taylor and Francis did let us put this in here, is basically they just pointed over to the authors. They say it's the author's responsibility to negotiate the rights. This is not something that they put in their contracts. They do not mention it. It is world rights, and they move on. So if the author is knowledgeable enough, or if perhaps they're working with a literary agent, they would stipulate these. So again, I have a hard time kind of swallowing this, and I think to the fact that if an author does sign over world rights, then Taylor and Francis is then choosing where they want to distribute that content. And it could be because they don't have a distribution office in every country. So again, there's certain things that do kind of come up with that. We also contacted Cambridge. They weren't able to give us a full response, but in general, they also felt that what they're negotiating is for world rights, that it's not based off of a geographic location. And there is also our comic book example kind of coming back around. So from Ohio State University Press, the authorship example where he actually pointed out, particularly with DC and Marvel, a lot of the artists that worked with them had their subsidiary rights basically. Either we're not going to publish you or you have to sign everything over. So it did happen a lot, and he said now creatively a lot of artists are being more aware of what their rights are, what they can ask for. And so out of that sort of population of authors, so to speak, that it's coming up a lot more frequently. The textbook publishers are obviously an issue. We see this a lot. Pretty much every McGraw-Hill title that is an ebook as a textbook is not available in Canada. I'm going to assume that they're available in the US, but I really, really don't know. And then you can see a few other examples there. And then finally, again, back to Rowan's point around Springer, they are really that package access versus no access at all, depending on your size of school and what you can buy from them. So there are other publishers out there as well that kind of take this approach, and it's really disappointing to see when you start to get conversations between institutions that are vastly different sizes. So this is an example of, let me just pull up my next slide. So again, a Canadian author that is unavailable in Canada. And it is also from Pearson, which again, it's a textbook publisher. It's probably why. We could dig into it a little bit further, but you can even see one was from 2016, one was from 2019. So they're continuing to also not provide access in our context. So it's just an ongoing issue. And then you get this lovely title, which is kind of also how this sparked this discussion. So this is a UBC Vancouver faculty member, and it is not available in our country. And I fear ever trying to reach out to him. I mean, I'm not on the Vancouver campus, but if I ever tried to contact him and say, did you know that when you published your book that it would never be made available in your own country and you can't use it for your students as an e-textbook? Pretty sure he'd be quite upset. So I really, I don't even want to broach the subject with him, but this is just another example of that happening. And then finally, this is a Canadian author, Canadian publisher, and unavailable in Canada. So kind of the worst of the worst out of all of them is that you just have like the whole trifecta. And you can see the United States has access, Wales has access, and the Netherlands. An unusual situation. And so it does go back to sometimes you'll start to see some of these crop up where it's a Canadian author, but what they're talking about also affects other countries around the world. So they may be getting into situations where their contract is prohibiting them from circulating the content in the countries that may also value seeing that or researching in that area. So we're going to move to the effective rights negotiations. Oh, it wants to change. There you go. Oh. Ahead of ourselves. Oh, we've missed a slide. We may have lost a slide. I will talk you through it. So in general around ebook access, just to reiterate, some publishers do really feel that this is the author's responsibility. It's on them to know what they are going to have done with their book. And then authors, from what I have talked to, have no idea that this is happening. So this is kind of what happened with the faculty member on my campus. I approached her when I was putting this kind of presentation together with Rowan, and she actually let me see her contract from a certain publisher, from a certain textbook publisher. And there, as I mentioned earlier, there was no mention of territory, no mention of even format of how it was going to be distributed, and that had been actually agreed to verbally. So she had found out that in order to publish the second edition, they were encouraging her to move to an ebook format to make it cheaper for her students. She said, great, cheaper, that's fine. What she found out later was that it was only going to be available through bookstores, only for 2-year lease, so not even actually being able to have the students purchase it. If they were using it again within their 4-year degree, they'd have to repurchase that title. If you wanted it in print, you had to pay an additional cost for print on demand. And if you had accessibility concerns, you could not get that title in print directly from the publisher. You also had to pay for the ebook cost and pay for the print. So it was automatically disadvantaging certain groups of students. She was very much unhappy with this and has gotten nowhere negotiating back. But I hope that from my conversation with her, she will be more knowledgeable entering into any agreement going forward. And that's kind of all we can hope for at this point. Okay, and I'm going to hope that the rest of our slides are there. There we go.
All right, so what are some possible solutions? I think we all can agree that this is probably an issue that not a lot of people are even aware of. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so we could start at the scholarly communications piece. So we do need to maybe expand our author guides to explain their need to negotiate subsidiary rights and what aspects of those rights that they should be concerned with, to educate them on what could happen if they include certain things and exclude other things. So for sure they might want to retain all other rights except for maybe publishing it in an electronic format. They could probably sell a lot more books if they made it more widely available to other countries, as well as the publisher would make more money by selling more books. So there is some incentive there for them. So right now there's not really any guidelines that say that if you do this, this will happen, or if you do this, this will not happen. So there's nothing out there that exists that we know of. And so the question is, do we educate the authors, the publishers, our vendors? Do we tell authors that they need a lawyer when they're publishing their books? Because it seems to be that might be the piece that's missing. So authors need a better understanding of how their decisions are going to actually influence the people who want to buy their books around the world. And we don't need to presume that certain content will not be useful to certain countries, because right now it seems like there's a presumption there. And it also seems that country restrictions are very archaic. They're very much based in the print world. And there's also concern that authors seem to think that if they publish their book online, it is more likely to be pirated. And actually, there's research that shows that that is not at all the case. So just because it's published online does not make it more likely that someone's going to go and steal it. People are just as likely to go and scan an entire print copy of a book and use that. An example would be the music industry. So the pirating of music has not really increased since streaming came into play. Right back in the day when we all used CDs and Napster was a big thing, people were pirating things just as much then, and we were still using physical copies of items. So really, it's about educating publishers, literary agents, or vendors. Someone needs to make a bit of a stink to make this actually change. And then, so, there we go. So really, we need to educate, like I said, the publishers and the vendors, especially about this title by title availability issue, where I feel like we're talking a lot about the return on investment of these big journal packages, right? We're breaking up the big deal packages, and yet here we are talking about ebooks in the same model that we're dealing with e-journals. So what's going to happen in a few years from now when people say, we don't want to buy that 30,000 collection of ebooks because we're only using, maybe 500 titles or even less than that. So why are we creating these new package deals that we can't choose title by title anymore? It's very much, old school, kind of a thing in the past that I think we should be moving away from. And this really goes right down to the ties to librarianship. So every aspect of this issue is really core to libraries. So equal access is a pillar to librarianship, and yet we're limiting access based on a country that somebody lives in. The practices go really against many of ALA's statements. Their statement on diversity says that ALA promotes equal access to information for all persons and recognizes the ongoing need to increase awareness of and responsiveness to the diversity of the communities that we serve. And so, we are based in Canada, but we have very strong ties to ALA, right? In Canada, we don't really have an association for our entire country, so we go by what ALA says. As well, by limiting access to resources, particularly related to geographic locations, you're giving access to a very narrow selection of titles to certain individuals, which is definitely creating bias, right? Researchers have very limited access to content within their countries. They don't have access to content that's being published elsewhere. So they don't have access to all of the scholarly research. And ACRL's long-term vision outlines academic and research librarians and libraries as being essential to a thriving global community of learners and scholars. How can we be global if we don't have access to the same resources? And ALA's own strategic plan and policies talk about international relations, and it completely contravenes the actions that we're seeing and that are demonstrated. But really, there's been absolutely no advocacy on any part to rectify the situation. All right, and so really we have to give a big thank you to all of the publishers and the vendors who sort of went out on a limb a little bit to provide their feedback and their thoughts, as well as I had a ton of responses from a ton of different librarians across the world. And so I told them all I would give them a shout out and that I would send them a copy of our presentation. And so they, it came from everywhere from Canada, Ireland, Scotland, England, South Africa, USA, tons of libraries. So we were really, really happy with the feedback that we got. And it was really interesting, not so much from the US library who was sort of shocked as to that this was a thing, but pretty much all of the other libraries that were outside of the United States said, hey, yeah, we've been seeing these messages for years. We just thought that was just what we had to get used to. And we were like, well, that seems silly. Let's do something about it. That's it.
I don't know if anybody has questions. Yes, sorry. Yep.
So the SPARC authors addendum, and then of course there's the Canadian Association of Research Libraries also has an authors addendum.
Yeah.
Do they address these issues at all?
It's a good question.
Not that I know of.
It's been a while since I've read them, but I can't remember this showing up.
Yeah, not that we're aware of. We did, quite a bit of research before we started this, because we thought, somebody must have addressed this already in those types of situations. It hasn't been talked about since 2011, 2010. There's very, very little research or talk about it. And I think it's because a lot of the people who are, other than Carl, the people who are associated either at the higher levels, like a director or an associate director, wouldn't have the knowledge of the intricate collections piece that us individual librarians do. As well, a lot of people who sit on boards or are part of working groups are often based in the US. And so there's very little involvement from librarians outside of the US, so we don't get these diverse perspectives.
I would say too, I ended up talking to Princeton University Press while I've been here, and they said that basically if you just Google this, all you'll see is from the perspective of authors writing for authors, not, or even publishers writing for authors, not from the library perspective.
Yep.
I have a couple comments, questions. So my name is Alicia Zorzell. I'm the Kobe rep for Canada. And I wanted to thank you first for doing this work, because I was also one of the members that thought it was a Canadian issue. I didn't think it was I just thought it was a Canadian issue, because we have a lot of these things that happen in Canada. But I did talk to our Eastern, New England rep, and they actually are seeing a lot of it coming up in the United States as well. So you may not hear it from one particular library in the US, but the rep is seeing kind of a larger picture, and it is happening there as well. So I think it's something that all libraries should be aware of.
So I'll shame a publisher a little bit. So the evidence-based model that I was referring to was Taylor and Francis. And going through the selections in the past couple months has been very interesting, because there was a bunch of reasons why rights were lost, but in particular there was a large set of titles that were only available for sale in Canada for 1 year. If you didn't buy it in that 1 year piece, you could not buy it as an ebook again. You'd have to buy it in print or through an aggregator. So just a fun fact.
And I'll also add that we thought, we had this assumption based in Canada that the United States has everything, and we get a very little fraction of it. And so we were very surprised that the US did not have access to all of those titles. And not even, they didn't have, most of us didn't have access to a lot of the textbook titles, but even a lot of the the non-textbook titles they didn't have access to. So that's actually what led us to okay, this is obviously a way bigger issue, and so that's what led us down the road to ask all of these other libraries across the world as to what was going on.
Did you have another question?
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, as far as our perspective, or myself and my supervisors sitting next to me, but I would love to kind of look more into this as far as our role and how we can manage and assist. With that said, and I'm not trying to put the ownership on the libraries, because it's not, but I think it's a great opportunity for libraries to educate faculty, because it's harder for us to go out there, to talk to these publishers once it's already been set in place, but to have an educated group of faculty, and potentially it could be like a course that can be taken at the PhD level as a student, so they're aware before they get their PhD that this is something that they need to know. So just an idea that's coming in my head, but I say this while knowing that I would also encourage, some sort of work on our end with the publishers.
So our scholarly communications office on our campus meets with students all the time when they're preparing to publish journals,
Right.
not books.
Right.
So I think it's an extension of that conversation.
Yes, that would be great. And then the last was more of a question, was that one of those first slides that you had with all of the Canadian titles that were not available. So did you specifically go out to find titles that were not available in Canada? And then
So we've been gathering them.
yeah, that's what I figured. I'm like, that's not a random selection.
The textbook project that I was running, essentially we bought any books that were required or recommended titles for courses at our institution. We ran a project where we bought them, provided that they were available through a library supplier. And so this selection of titles is literally just like a glob of those titles that I just took and then just sent them off. The only ones that were specifically taken on purpose was the 9 Lives of Charlotte Taylor, because it's published by a Canadian author and a Canadian publisher. So I was interested to see what the availability would be about that. The Becker's World of the Cell, because it's a global edition, I was curious to know about the availability. And The Tempest, because I thought that was a fairly generic title, and so I wanted to know. Yeah, and it's a reprint, and so I was a little bit. Pardon? Yep. Yep. And yeah, which is just kind of weird. But yeah, so for the most part, there was no rhyme or reason as to why those specific titles were chosen.
I would say though a couple of my UBC examples were pulled from a lovely list that was created by Gobi, and I just went through it until I found some.
I mean, some of them are really interesting because it's like I don't know how they're acquiring any sales, but the ones at the bottom are
Yeah, like women talking a novel. Well, okay, you'd think more people would want to read that, but whatever.
Yeah. Sorry, you had a question?
Did you have a sense of a percentage, or I mean,
No.
25 million?
No, frankly, like I would want to look at that.
Yeah.
Like that would really be the next step as part of this, is to try and actually get an idea of what out there is not available. It's just that it started to crop up more and more this past year, and you keep seeing it, that it just started a conversation.
And do you do, just one more thing, do you find that you do this search and then you go to Amazon to find out about discoverability, the E, and whether or not you can just place an order and have it shipped from whatever? And is that mostly the case that you're able to do that?
So we can't buy any e-content through Amazon because of the restriction, the type of the format restrictions, because students wouldn't be able, unless they had the. I don't even know how that would work. And in Canada, it would be Kindle, and in Canada we have Kobo. We don't, you can't do Kindle purchases in Canada, for the most part, and so. Yeah, so I don't think it would work the same way as if we were purchasing the print book in Amazon, and I didn't check on print rights on any of them, mainly just the electronic rights. And we were only, for the purpose of this, we were just using the 2 main library aggregator platforms, and that was because our e-textbook project, one of the stipulations was that it had to be provided through a library supplier.
Literally shot up at the same time. I think you had your hand up earlier. No? Okay.
Okay, I just had a comment, Ariel, on something you said about not wanting to tell the UBC prof that his book wasn't available, but I think maybe you should.
I only fear because he's not on my campus, right? Like I fear I'm gonna get him angry at the library from a roundabout way. But I agree. I think it's a conversation that needs to be had with faculty, and I think the one that I did have with the one faculty member on my campus went really well. But at the same time, I think we don't have all of the pieces of knowledge, and there is that scholarly communications angle. There is the angle of us being the ones that are purchasing content. And then it's also the angle of what are they wanting to ask for. If they actually want to limit access from certain countries, hold that back and have another option to republish that in the future, great. That's their wish to do that, but I want them to be knowledgeable about what they're doing, right? And I don't think that they are at this point, for the most part.
Yeah, because from a university press perspective, because I've worked at 2, you know, if the author doesn't have an agent, then they have to negotiate, you know, for themselves. And I know, you know, from University Press, we try to buy global rights. And when we can't, it's because the agent has negotiated for rights, you know, in Europe or in Canada. But if the author doesn't have an agent, then I think it's great if they're, you know, made aware of this stuff and this issue.
I think it would be interesting too to also say, if you are going to hold that back because you want to republish it yourself with another publisher, then please just go out and do it. Don't wait 30 years, forget about it, and then never do it, right? That's what we don't want. So, yeah. And what was your question? Sorry, in the back.
I was just going to make a comment as a nonprofit book publisher. So all of my contracts, I want all rights. I want to be able to sell it everywhere. It doesn't make any sense to do restrictions unless an author, and I've never had an author, I'm in microbiology, I've never had an author say, I don't want to sell in Brazil or something.
Exactly.
You want to sell it everywhere, but what the limitations are is, one, I'm able to negotiate in business decisions and distribution channels. So I may not have an ebook distributor in Canada.
Yeah.
So
Mhm.
you might not be able to get those things. Also, there's this little nasty thing called GST and VAT
Mhm.
that publishers have to pay when they're selling their products into certain countries, and that may limit.
Mhm.
So maybe strictly business decisions
Yep.
and not a desire to limit.
Honestly, I think that
information.
that's why we saw that one example where it was on one aggregator and not on another.
Right.
Probably it came down to a business
You
decision.
didn't have a contract with that other aggregator.
Exactly. Yeah.
That wasn't available. But
Yeah.
I think most publishers are trying to disseminate the content as widely as possible.
Mhm.
So there really isn't any logical reason unless there were some ancient restrictions or business decisions.
I think the part that we want to start the conversation about is why is it happening so much more frequently than it was even a few years ago, or at least to our knowledge it was.
Any other questions? I hope you all learned something. Okay. Oh yeah, we are. It's 4:15. And if anyone does work with faculty on this issue, please share this information with them because we would love for this to get out and talk about it more.